G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history, about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.23 The Imperial Church in Corporate, Part 3 The Heresy Hunter. In episodes 3.19 and 3.20, I recounted the rise of the Gnostics. In episode 3.21, The Heretic, I related the story of Marcion. In episode 3.22, The Martyr, I introduced Justin Martyr, the greatest Christian intellectual and writer of the middle of the 2nd century. The growing Imperial Church in Corporate faced a rising number of challenges. The Marcionites had constructed a rival franchise that threatened the business model of the Church. Gnostics had infiltrated the Orthodox congregations, subverting the teachings of the corporate hierarchy, the presbyters and bishops. In the late 2nd century, other troublemakers emerged in central Anatolia to vex the Church. The hotspot was the little region of Phrygia. St. Paul had passed through Phrygia in his travels. The agitators were Montanus and his two famed female proselytizers, Maximilla and Prisca. Their biographies are blank. Their dating is very uncertain. They could have launched their mission around 140, during the lifetime of Justin. Or perhaps they did so a generation later, nearer to the year 180. We just don't know. Later Church Fathers suspected Montanus was a former priest of Phrygia's native goddess Cybele. She was known to the Romans as Great Mother. The Fathers had good reason for their suspicions. Like the devotees of Cybele, Montanus practiced a raucous and ecstatic form of devotion. Think some modern Pentecostals. His opponents found his congregations vulgar, wild and uncontrolled. No offence, Pentecostals. The Montanists seem to have valued martyrdom, ritual purity through fasts and penances, and chastity. Their big shtick was prophecy. They claimed to dispense new revelations, ones beyond those found in the Scriptures. They believed that their headquarters in a little village in Phrygia was destined to be the new Jerusalem. Montanism spread like wildfire in rural Anatolia. Montanist inscriptions dated to the mid-3rd century are the earliest bold Christian declarations outside the Roman catacombs. Montanist later followers called their movement the New Prophecy. Their opponents labelled it the Phrygian Heresy. To their exasperation, though, these adversaries had a hard time saying wherein the heresy lay. After all, the Montanists read the same books as the congregations of the Imperial Church. The Montanists, pretty much, held the same beliefs as those Christians. Still, the new prophecy was vehemently opposed by the corporate bishops from its earliest days. They denounced the Montanist prophets as inspired by demons, not by the Holy Spirit. They were horrified to see, and I quote, women prophesying in a frenzied manner, unsuitably and abnormally. Oh, we can't have that, can we? Fighting Marcion was easy. Marcion was clearly a heretic. Marcion had a different collection of sacred books, 2 gods, and did not believe that Jesus had a physical body. Marcion's followers had a separate organisation. They didn't show up at Orthodox get-togethers. Like the Valentinian Gnostics, The acolytes of Montanus didn't have independent congregations. They popped up in established churches all over the place. Montanists were hard to spot. To many Christians, they just seemed to be more exuberant than other brethren. What was the problem with that? The corporate bishops had a hard time dealing with the movement. Now, why were the Orthodox bishops so disturbed? Oh, of course, the rigid patriarchy of the Imperial Church was aghast that the Montanists esteemed women. But there was more to it. Current thinking is that at its core, this was a conflict between the urban and the rural. From its beginning, Christianity was a faith of towns and cities, a faith of literacy and urbane discussion. The Montanists found their most fervid adherents in the countryside. The urban bishops neither trusted nor valued the country bumpkins. What would they know? Why, hang on. Surely only a tiny proportion of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were city dwellers. Were not almost all subjects of Rome tilling fields? Was the Imperial Church simply ignoring this vast multitude? Not quite. Compared to other ancient civilizations, and even medieval Europe, the Roman Empire was an imperium of towns and cities. During the High Middle Ages, call it 1300, only 5% of Europeans resided in urban areas. Modern studies conclude that a whopping 25% of the empire's inhabitants lived in towns and cities. Even the United States did not achieve Roman levels of urban concentration until the late 19th century. The Church Imperial brought forth warriors to defend its franchise against encroachments from the Gnostics, the Marcionites, and the Montanists. These warriors were the heresy hunters. First of these was one Hegesippus the Holy, somewhat younger than Justin Martyr. Now, I originally thought his name was pronounced Hegesippus. Shows what I know. He wrote perhaps around the year 165. By that time, both Justin and Marcion had left the stage. As usual, we rely on our old friend Bishop Eusebius. Yes, I know I mention Eusebius every second episode. I have no choice. He is just the repository of so much information. Eusebius thought Hegesippus was a convert to Christianity from Judaism. The bishop was awed by Hegesippus' erudition in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Jewish customs. Since Eusebius was incompetent in all these disciplines, we can't really trust his opinions on these matters. All we really know about Hegesippus is that he was born somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, travelled through Greece to Rome, and returned to the east to write 5 books variously translated as memoirs or memorandum. As so often, these have been lost to history and only preserved as quotations by the illustrious bishop. Hegesippus passed down many traditions from the earliest church. He preserved stories of James the Just, the disciples, and other early figures. He was the first Christian chronicler. Not a critical historian, mind, but a simple reporter. Justin Martyr had coyly hinted of a book about heresies, the Syntagma. Not long after, Hegesippus was ringing alarm bells about these deviancies. Hegesippus believed that the church was corrupted 50 years after the death of Jesus, during the reign of the Emperor Vespasian's son, Domitian. You can discover more about Vespasian and his role in the Great Jewish Revolt in my episode 3.5, The Great Revolt Part 1, Lighting the Fuse. Here is Hegesippus. Quote, "Up to the reign of Domitian, the church had remained like a virgin, pure and uncorrupted. For if there were any persons who were disposed to tamper with the wholesome rule of the preaching of salvation, they still lurked in some dark place of concealment. When the sacred band of apostles had closed their lives, then did the confederacy of godless error take its rise through the treachery of false teachers, who, seeing that none of the apostles any longer survived, at length attempted to oppose the preaching of the truth. End quote. The man who declared outright war on heretics was Irenaeus, the heresy hunter. He dominated Christian thought for the remainder of the 2nd century. Now, I've heard his name pronounced several different ways by reputable scholars. Irenaeus, Irenaeus, Irenaeus. If they can't agree, I figure I can cut myself some slack here. I'll call him Irenaeus. Just humour me. Irenaeus means peacemaker in Greek. A better name would have been Ptolemaeus, the firebrand. Irenaeus was born in Anatolia, in no less than the city of Smyrna, the hometown of the celebrated Bishop Polycarp. You can hear more about Polycarp in episode 3.14, After the Apostles Part 2, Holy Books and Blessed Bishops. Tradition held that, like many others, the young Irenaeus was a student of the octogenarian Polycarp, who had himself learnt at the feet of the nonagenarian disciple John. We have no reason to doubt that. Irenaeus was rather younger than Hegesippus. He was of the generation that followed Justin Martyr and Marcion. He loved Justin and despised Marcion. In his youth, Irenaeus was a priest in the important Gallic city of Lugdunum, modern Lyon. 10 years after the death of Justin, perhaps 175, his congregation dispatched him to Rome to discuss doctrinal matters with the Pope. Irenaeus was the ideal candidate, thoroughly familiar with the theological debates of both Greek East and Latin West. He returned to Lugdunum and accepted its episcopal tiara around the year 180. To the disappointment of much later church fathers, they could find no evidence that Irenaeus was martyred. Irenaeus probably died at a venerable age around the year 200. It is cheering to know that, though he died 170 years after Jesus, Irenaeus was only 3 degrees separated from the founder of Christianity. Irenaeus decisively stamped his imprint on the growing Imperial Church in corporate. Before Irenaeus, Christians supported their beliefs by citing the Tanakh, the Old Testament. These earlier Christians had a much more informal understanding of their own writings. Consider Justin Martyr. Writing a generation before Irenaeus, Justin Martyr drops only the most casual references to Christian books to support his arguments. For example, quote, Dialogue with Trypho 103:8. In the memoirs which, as I have said, were drawn up by the apostles and their followers, it is recorded that sweat fell like drops of blood while Jesus was praying and saying, If it be possible, let this cup pass. End quote. That quote is from the Gospel of Luke, a book Justin calls a memoir. Justin does not dignify his source with a title or author. And here is Justin with the first recorded reference to Revelation. Quote, Dialogue with Trypho 81:4. Moreover, also among us a man named John, one of the apostles of Christ, prophesied in a revelation made to him that those who have believed in our Christ will spend 1,000 years in Jerusalem, and that hereafter the general and, in short, the eternal resurrection and judgment of all will likewise take place. End quote. Justin only cites 3 Gospels and Revelation. Justin is lackadaisical. He does not revere his sources, let alone think of them as sacred. Move forward a generation. Irenaeus has a completely different view about Christian books. The Church was threatened by Marcion's well-oiled franchise, the Gnostics, and the pesky followers of Montanus. To Irenaeus, being a Christian meant having a solid collection of sacred books, just like the Jews. Deciding what went into the canon was of central importance. In all the Roman world, only the Jews and Christians had a sacred canon, a canon that was the source of all truth. Pagan religions had nothing like the Bible. Irenaeus' list of Christian books is not only more encyclopedic than Justin's vague enumeration, but more reverential. He cites all four Gospels, and not just as memoirs, but as euangelion. Now, that's Greek for glad tidings or good news. Irenaeus is the first to mention the book of Acts. He also cites all of Paul's letters, save for Philemon and Hebrews. He refers to Revelation and some of the general epistles. Like many others, he believes that the Shepherd of Hermas is a holy book. Against Justin's vague references to anonymous memoirs, Irenaeus provides solid quotations from named books, such as, quote, Against Heresies 3:11-8. For that euangelion, according to John, relates Christ's glorious generation from the Father, thus declaring, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But that, according to Luke, taking up Christ's priestly character, commenced with Zacharias the priest, offering sacrifice to God. Matthew, again, relates his generation as a man, saying, The book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. This, then, is the gospel of his humanity, of a humble and a meek man. Mark, on the other hand, commences with a reference to the prophetical spirit coming down from on high to men, saying, The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And on this account he made a compendious and cursory narrative, for such is the prophetical character. End quote. Irenaeus cites the Gospels as authority. He provides the first evidence that the Church was developing a body of writings with a divine power equal to that of the Tanakh. Irenaeus is the earliest Christian writer to have a New Testament canon something like our own. Not that everyone agreed with his canon. This was still very much in contention. Sometime during Irenaeus' lifetime, a long-forgotten scribe penned what we call the Muratorian fragment. That precious document is named after its discoverer, the 18th century Italian historian, Father Ludovico Muratori. The good father retrieved it from an Italian library in Milan. This sliver itemises the sacred books of the Christians. Only the two Gospels of Luke and John, the book of Acts and Revelation, all the letters of Paul save Hebrews. The fragment also includes the wisdom of Solomon, the Apocalypse of Peter, and commends the Shepherd of Hermas. In the last episode, I mentioned Justin Martyr's mysterious book, the Syntagma. Irenaeus ran with Justin's concept of heresy as incorrect belief, and transformed it into a major fixation of the Imperial Church. Irenaeus' greatest work was On the Detection and Overthrow of the So-Called Knowledge, written in Greek. The book is a tedious read. No one could accuse Irenaeus of having a sense of levity. But the book is an invaluable compendium. The book was immensely influential and much quoted. By historical accident, the Greek original has been lost. We only know it through a Latin translation, with the title Against Heresies. With Against Heresies, Irenaeus created a whole new Christian genre, one that flourished through the Middle Ages. Irenaeus was the first High Commissioner of the Christian Thought Police. Irenaeus' preoccupation with what people believed was an innovation in the Roman world. Ancient religions didn't give a fig about what people believed, only with what they did. You could believe anything you liked about Jupiter, but there were strict rules about how you could sacrifice to him. The Greeks and Romans had no concept of correct and incorrect belief, of heresy and orthodoxy. Even Second Temple Judaism had allowed a multitude of beliefs to flourish. For more on the vast flowering of thought in that period, set your cat on your lap and rewind to my episode 3.2, The Rococo World of the Second Temple. The rabbinic Judaism that emerged slowly in the centuries after the Great Revolt placed the lightest constraints on belief, and in its later stage of development extolled disagreement as a virtue. For a modern example, consider these remarks by Lex Rothenberg of Judaism Unbound. Check out my living bibliography at www.historyinthebible.com to find out more about Judaism Unbound.
There's Jews who define what they do in ways that is different from how we define religion. That is not news. The word religion ties largely to Christian understandings of what we think of, quote-unquote faith traditions, quote-unquote belief systems, all these things about stuff you think. And it turns out a lot of Jews do Jewish in a way that is not about what they think. If you ask them what they think, and is the set of things that they think Jewish? Do you think Jewish things? Do you believe Jewish things? Do you believe biblical things? Do you believe, I think a lot of Jews say no. I think I say no. I don't know if my theology is a Jewish theology. I mean, I don't think it's an un-Jewish theology. I do lots of Jewish things. So for me, it's simpler. And that's not a criticism. You have to make a decision when you're constructing a survey about what your sort of core axes are, what your core questions are, what you're looking to get at. Every question you ask is actually a decision. It's not just like a value neutral thing. And so the questions they tend to ask are about what people think, what they hold dear, what they care about. And I think a lot of stuff is more along the lines in Jews' lives, is more about what they do and don't do.
There is a notable exception to that indifference to belief. The Roman-era philosophers who followed Plato insisted that Plato's writings were dogmatic. Irenaeus borrowed the Platonist strategies to attack his many opponents. The Gnostics, who thought Jesus was purely divine. The Ebionites, who supposed him wholly human. The Marcionites, who asserted that Christianity had nothing to do with the Jews. And the Montanists, who alleged they had new revelations to impart. Irenaeus insisted that real Christians had maintained in unbroken succession the doctrines given to them by Jesus and his disciples. This repository of Christian truth was safeguarded by the Church's corporate headquarters in Rome. Those who did not follow the diktats of the Imperial Church were heretics. Irenaeus took his cue from Paul's first letter to Timothy. Quote, 1 Timothy 4:1. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will renounce the faith by paying attention to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the hypocrisy of liars whose consciences are seared with a hot iron. They forbid marriage and demand abstinence from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Avoid the profane chatter and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. End quote. I have a grand discussion of the letter to Timothy in episode 2.52, The Many Puzzles of Paul's Epistles. Irenaeus' opponents were not merely misguided, or mistaken, or ignorant, or foolish. They were maliciously evil, the spawn of Satan. He charged the heretics with the same crimes that the Roman state accused the corporate Christians of: flagita, scalera, and malefica, sexual outrages, wickedness, and evil deeds. Irenaeus demanded these evil doers must be expelled from the company of good Christians. Christianity incorporated that precept into its very DNA. Let's just look at one example amongst millions. This is from the 19th century. In 1860, one Theophilus Packard was the teaching elder at a small Presbyterian church in Illinois in the United States. After 20 years of marriage, his wife Elizabeth decided that she preferred the congregation at the Methodist church across the street. Theophilus was horrified. The Methodists were heretics. They were no more Christians than Muslims were. Theophilus' parishioners were of one accord. Elizabeth was insane. With the apathetic acquiescence of the state, the elder committed his wife to an asylum. Elizabeth spent years fighting for her release from detention. A special jury was eventually convened to consider the matter. The jurors declared her sane in just a few minutes. Elizabeth returned home to find that Theophilus, her devout husband and pastor, had absconded with all their children and all her money. This story has a happy ending. Elizabeth spent the rest of her long life campaigning for the rights of those incarcerated in asylums. She became a wealthy author and gleefully outlived her husband by more than a decade. Good one, Elizabeth. Where was I? Ah, yes, Irenaeus. What Irenaeus failed to comprehend was that many of the beliefs he called heresies were often simply the traditional and accepted opinions of a generation or two before. And thanks to the Nag Hammadi finds, we now know Irenaeus often misinterpreted mystical reflections and metaphors as historical statements. He believed that every evil was founded by a single miscreant. In this typical extract from Against Heresies, Irenaeus rails against the Gnostics Saturnius and Basilides, whom I discussed in episode 3.20, The Crusade of Valentinus. Quote, Against Heresies 24. Arising among these men, Saturninus and Basilides laid hold of some favourable opportunities. They set forth one Father unknown to all, who made angels, archangels, powers and potentates. The world again, and all things therein, were made by a certain company of 7 angels. Man too was the work of angels. They also laid it down as a truth, that the Saviour was without birth, without body, and without figure. And they maintained that the God of the Jews was one of the angels, and Christ came to destroy the God of the Jews, but to save such as believe in him. They declare also that marriage and generation are from Satan. Many of those, too, who belong to this school abstain from animal food, and draw away multitudes by a temperance of this kind. They hold, moreover, that some of the prophecies were uttered by those angels who made the world, and some by Satan. End quote. Following the Platonist purists, Irenaeus stressed the youth of the heresies against the antiquity of true belief. He also charged that the heretics' beliefs were absurdly complicated and contradictory. Because of their very variety, Irenaeus declared that none of them could be true. He supposed that what we now know were a variety of wildly disparate beliefs was a single philosophy. Imagine holding that Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism are part of some mythical monolith called Indian religion, and then attacking this amalgamation as inconsistent. Irenaeus demanded absolute uniformity of Christian belief. Without uniformity, there would be no distinctive ideology at all. Without uniformity, it would be impossible to draw boundaries between the pagans and the Christians, and the Jews and the Christians. Without the insistence of Irenaeus, or Marcion for that matter, Christianity would never have become more than a catch-all term to cover a variety of beliefs and practices, rather like our term Gnosticism. This insistence on uniformity of belief came at a very high price. Variations in belief only became contentious when the Church demanded uniformity. Hereafter, Christian factions assaulted each other in the harshest of terms. Wicked, godless, evil. Many of the conflicts, often bloody, in the first 15 centuries of Christianity arose over differences in beliefs. Irenaeus thought that the simplest way to guarantee that all the congregations held right belief was to ensure that they used the same books, the sacred books of truth. A few decades before, Justin Martyr was not at all fussed about books. Irenaeus may well have come up with the idea of a revered canon all by himself. A faith that demanded adherence to books required readers for those books. I mentioned in episode 3.4, After the Temple Part 2, the Christians, that maybe 15% of adult men in the big cities and a rather lesser percentage of adult women could read. Elsewhere it was probably more like 1 in 100. And not all of those readers, by any means, could compose a sentence and write. A ballpark estimate for a typical Christian congregation in Irenaeus' time is 80 people. These would have been about equally divided between adult men, adult women, and children. With some back-of-the-envelope calculations, that would mean a typical congregation would boast 2 or 3 men who could read, and perhaps 1 woman. All the works of the earliest Christian authors, all the letters, all the Gospels, were directed to these literate members in each congregation. These readers became essential. The literate were on the fast track to senior positions as presbyters and bishops in the shiny new corporate hierarchy of the Church. Ensuring uniform right belief was a job only for readers who used their literacy to establish trust and authority. Whether by accident or design, uniformity demanded literacy, and literacy provided power. Irenaeus thought he was attacking the enemies of true Christianity. True Christianity, of course, was his Christianity. Really, Irenaeus was not so much describing differences as creating them. He was constructing boundaries against the communities of the Jews, the Montanists, Marcionites, and Gnostics. Irenaeus played a crucial role in defining what it was to be a Christian and differentiating these people from the Jews. As the noted scholar Daniel Boyarin puts it, Irenaeus and his successors became border guards. They laboured to stop smugglers from trafficking illicit religious beliefs into the heartland. Boyarin argues that the rabbis of the first centuries also developed the notion of heresy to define boundaries at the same time as the Christians. At just the same time as Christians began to attack heretics, the rabbis attacked the minim, kinds or sects, divisions. This happened quite independently, although perhaps both faiths took their lead from the dogmatizing Platonists. Here is the Mishnah, a work that was gestating during the lifetime of Irenaeus. Quote, Mishnah Sanhedrin 10. These are those who have no place in the next world. One who denies that the resurrection of the dead is a dogma of the Torah. One who denies that the oral Torah is from heaven. And Jewish Epicureans. End quote. For the first time in the long and storied history of Judaism, the Mishnah promulgates a rule of faith for who is kosher and who is not. The rabbis pretended that their novel diktats were actually eternal Jewish verities. This gave them license to condemn the many lush fruits of Second Temple Judaism. The Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Boethusians, amongst others. This provided a mechanism that allowed the rabbis to fence off the Jews for Jesus fans. As the Jews for Jesus clubs faded into history, the rabbis abandoned their rudimentary notions of heresy and orthodoxy, while the Christians strengthened theirs. In the next episode, I explore how Irenaeus rehabilitated Paul. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.